The rain fell in heavy sheets as Lena stood at the edge of the porch, her bare feet on the cold, damp wood. The countryside air was thick with the scent of wet earth, a sharp contrast to the sterile luxury of the city apartment she had fled. Each drop of rain seemed to pierce her skin, mirroring the ache deep inside her chest. She gripped the railing, her knuckles white, as memories of Daniel's face the night he found out washed over her like the storm before her eyes. She had never imagined it would come to this. Daniel, the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, had been her partner in everything, in ambition, in dreams, in building a life together. Yet, she had shattered it all with a single unthinkable act. The warmth of his touch, the quiet laughter they shared on lazy Sunday mornings, the gentle way he would trace her collarbone as he whispered secrets meant only for her, all of it was gone. She had destroyed it with her betrayal, an act so incomprehensible that she could hardly reconcile it with the woman she once believed herself to be. Max. The name was like a bitter echo in her mind, yet it stirred something else in her too, something darker, deeper, and more confusing. The donkey had been a curious fixture in their lives, at first a creature Daniel had rescued from an abusive farmer, bringing him home as a symbol of his unyielding kindness. At first, Lena had found Max amusing, his stubborn demeanor a strange but endearing foil to their well-ordered life. She had laughed at his antics, his refusal to be led anywhere he didn't want to go, his inexplicable ability to find his way back to the barn, no matter how far he wandered. But over time, something shifted. What began as a passing fascination grew into something she couldn't name. Max became her silent confidant, his wide, unblinking eyes holding a depth that unnerved her. On restless nights when Daniel worked late or seemed distant, she found herself slipping away to the barn, sitting in the straw beside Max, pouring out her secrets to a creature who never judged, never interrupted. She told herself it was harmless, a way to fill the emptiness she didn't dare acknowledge even to herself. But it wasn't harmless. The line between affection and something far more dangerous blurred one warm summer evening, when she pressed her forehead to Max's and felt a spark, a strange, electric pull that left her breathless and confused. She hated herself for it, yet she returned to him night after night, seeking solace in his presence, his unyielding calm, his unwavering attention. It wasn't love, not in any sense she could articulate, but it was something she couldn't let go of, even as it consumed her with guilt. The night Daniel found out was seared into her memory like a wound that refused to heal. She had been careless, letting her guard down, and he had walked into the barn at the worst possible moment. The look on his face, the disbelief, the horror, the heartbreak was a mirror reflecting the depths of her own shame. He didn't shout or accuse, he simply turned and walked away, leaving her to chase after him, begging for forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. The divorce papers came 3 weeks later. Daniel didn't respond to her calls, her letters, her tearful pleas. He disappeared from her life as though she had never existed, leaving her adrift in a sea of her own making. She signed the papers with shaking hands, her tears smudging the ink, and packed a single suitcase. The city, with its noise and relentless pace, became unbearable. She fled to the only place she could think of, her late grandmother's old countryside home, a crumbling relic of her childhood summers, tucked away in a valley far from prying eyes. Now, as the storm raged on, Lena wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the summer heat. The house was cold and empty, filled with echoes of a past that felt as distant as another lifetime. The old furniture was draped in sheets, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and forgotten memories. She hadn't touched the garden yet, hadn't unpacked anything more than the bare essentials. Every corner of the house reminded her of the person she used to be, a person she wasn't sure she could ever become again. And yet, despite everything, Max had followed her. He had appeared 2 days after she arrived, standing stubbornly at the edge of the property, his dark eyes fixed on her with a mix of defiance and something that felt like understanding. She had tried to shoo him away, but he refused to leave, standing his ground with a patience that only deepened her frustration. She didn't want him here, didn't want the reminder of everything she had lost. But Max, as always, had other plans. In the nights that followed, Lena found herself drawn to him again, despite her better judgment. She would sit on the porch, watching him graze in the distance, his ears twitching as though he could hear her every thought. Sometimes she spoke to him, her voice barely above a whisper, pouring out the pain she couldn't express to anyone else. He never moved closer, but he never left, his presence both a torment and a strange comfort. As the days turned into weeks, Lena began to feel the weight of her isolation. The silence of the countryside was deafening, the nights long and sleepless. She wandered the house aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. She thought of Daniel constantly, his smile, his strength, the way he used to hold her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. She thought of the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared, all of it reduced to ashes because of her weakness, her failure. But amidst the darkness, a small, stubborn flicker of something else began to take root. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a faint glimmer of determination. She couldn't undo what she had done, couldn't erase the pain she had caused, but perhaps she could find a way to atone. Perhaps she could piece together the fragments of her shattered life, one small step at a time. As the storm began to subside, Lena stepped off the porch, her feet sinking into the wet grass. Max stood at the edge of the field, his silhouette dark against the gray sky. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding, unsure of what she was looking for, unsure of what she might find. When she reached him, she placed a trembling hand on his coarse fur, her fingers curling into his mane. For the first time in weeks, the tears that came weren't from despair, but something closer to release. "I don't know if I can fix this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I have to try." Max didn't move, didn't react, but something in his steady presence seemed to answer her unspoken question. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the valley in a golden glow, Lena felt a flicker of warmth she hadn't felt in months. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The mornings in the countryside were deceptively peaceful, a quiet that blanketed the valleys and hills, interrupted only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Lena had hoped the silence would soothe her, but instead amplified the storm inside her. Each sunrise brought with it the weight of another day she didn't know how to face. But there was one constant, one shadow that seemed inescapable: Max. The donkey's presence was as inevitable as the sunrise. No matter how many times she tried to shoo him away or ignore him, Max was always there. In the mornings, she would find him grazing near the house, his dark eyes flicking up toward her as if silently daring her to address him. At night, she would hear the rhythmic crunch of his hooves on the dry grass outside her window, a steady reminder of everything she wanted to forget. She had come to the countryside to escape her past, but it had followed her in the form of this stubborn, infuriating creature. One particularly still morning, as the mist clung to the ground in thick, ghostly tendrils, Lena stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee. Her eyes, heavy from another sleepless night, scanned the horizon. And there he was, Max, standing beneath the old oak tree, his ears twitching in the breeze. She sighed, setting her coffee on the railing and descending the creaky steps toward him. "Don't you have somewhere else to be?" she muttered, her voice a mix of irritation and resignation. Max didn't respond, of course. He simply stared at her, his gaze steady and unyielding. It was maddening, the way he could make her feel exposed, as though he saw through every layer she tried to hide behind. She crossed her arms over her chest, standing a few feet away from him, unwilling to get any closer. "You're not helping, you know," she said, her voice softer now. "You just remind me." For a long moment, the two of them stood there in the foggy morning light, locked in a silent standoff. And then, as if deciding the conversation was over, Max turned his head and began to graze again. It was such a simple, dismissive gesture that Lena couldn't help but laugh, a sharp, unexpected sound that startled even herself. "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head. Absolutely impossible. Despite herself, Lena began to notice the small ways Max seemed to worm his way into her life. Every day he was there, a quiet, steady presence that demanded nothing from her but attention she didn't want to give. And yet, she couldn't ignore him. She began leaving scraps of vegetables for him near the porch, telling herself it was just to keep him away from the garden she had tentatively started to clear. But when she caught him nudging a bucket closer to her one afternoon, his eyes gleaming with what could only be described as mischief, she found herself laughing again, the sound surprising her with its warmth. There was something disarming about Max, something she couldn't quite put into words. He was stubborn, yes, but there was a quiet intelligence to him, a sense of knowing that made her feel less alone in her isolation. She began talking to him, at first in fleeting comments, "You're looking awfully smug today," and later in longer monologues. She told him about the weeds choking the garden, about the draft in the house she couldn't seem to fix. And when the nights grew long and her loneliness became unbearable, she told him about Daniel. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said one evening, sitting on the porch steps as Max stood nearby, his ears flicking in the moonlight. "I loved him. I still love him. But it's like I got lost somewhere along the way." Max made no sound, but his steady presence felt like an acknowledgement, a quiet reassurance that her words weren't disappearing into the void. She leaned her head against the railing, her chest tight with emotions she didn't know how to process. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable, until she finally stood and went inside, leaving Max to his grazing. As the days turned into weeks, their routines began to intertwine in ways Lena hadn't anticipated. Max followed her as she worked in the garden, his hooves crunching softly on the dirt as he wandered behind her. He seemed particularly interested in the tools, nosing at the handles of the spade and rake as if trying to understand their purpose. One afternoon, as she knelt to pull a stubborn root from the ground, Max leaned down and grabbed the hem of her shirt in his teeth, tugging gently. "Max," she exclaimed, swatting at him with her gloved hand. "What are you doing?" He released her shirt and took a step back, his expression as close to smug as a donkey's face could be. She couldn't help but laugh, the sound bubbling up despite her frustration. "You're unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "Completely unbelievable." But it wasn't just the small, mischievous moments that began to change her feelings toward him. There were quieter, more tender instances too, times when his presence felt like a balm for the ache she carried inside. One rainy afternoon, as the storm rattled the windows of the old house, Lena found herself standing in the doorway of the barn, watching Max as he huddled in the corner. His coat was damp, his ears drooping slightly, and for a moment she felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him. She crossed the barn slowly, her boots squelching in the muddy straw, and reached out a tentative hand. Max didn't move, his eyes fixed on hers as she placed her palm against his neck. His fur was warm and coarse beneath her touch, and she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, a quiet stillness that had been absent from her life for far too long. "You're not so bad, are you?" she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rain. Max leaned into her touch slightly, his breath warm against her cheek, and for the first time in months, Lena felt a glimmer of something she thought she had lost forever: connection. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, a quiet companionship that required no words, no explanations. Max became more than just a reminder of her past, he became a lifeline, a grounding force that kept her tethered to the present. And though she didn't fully understand the depth of her feelings for him, she knew one thing for certain: Max was no longer just a shadow of her mistakes. He was her silent companion, her unexpected ally in the battle to rebuild her life. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lena sat on the porch with Max grazing nearby. The weight in her chest hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow, more bearable. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Max's mane, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way forward. And maybe Max, in his stubborn, unyielding way, would be the one to help her find it. The garden was a tangled mess of neglect, a wilderness of weeds and overgrown vines that seemed to mock Lena with its wild, untamed chaos. It was clear no one had tended to it in years, and yet, something about the challenge called to her. Perhaps it was the metaphor too obvious to ignore. Her life, like the garden, had fallen into disrepair, overrun by mistakes and regret. If she could tame this unruly patch of earth, maybe she could begin to untangle herself too. She stood at the edge of the garden with her hands on her hips, the morning sun casting long shadows over the uneven ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil, and birds chirped in the distance, their songs a bright counterpoint to the somber weight in her chest. Max stood a few paces behind her, his ears twitching as he regarded her with what she swore was curiosity. "Don't look at me like that," she said, glancing back at him. "This was your idea, wasn't it? Leaving me here to clean up this mess." Max didn't respond, of course, but his steady gaze felt like an answer. She sighed and rolled up her sleeves, grabbing a rusted spade from the pile of tools she had found in the shed. The handle was worn smooth, the metal blade dull, but it would have to do. She knelt on the ground and plunged the spade into the earth, the first cut feeling oddly satisfying. The work was harder than she expected. The soil was dense, packed tight by years of neglect, and the roots of the weeds clung stubbornly to their hold. Sweat dripped from her brow as she wrestled with the ground, her muscles straining with each effort. Max wandered closer, his hooves crunching softly on the grass as he watched her struggle. At one point, she paused to catch her breath and glanced over at him, her irritation mounting. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked, her tone sharp. "A little help wouldn't hurt, you know." To her surprise, Max lowered his head and nudged the edge of the spade with his nose, his movements deliberate and almost playful. Lena blinked, caught off guard by the gesture. She laughed despite herself, a soft, breathless sound that echoed in the quiet morning. "Fine," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I guess you're moral support then." The days blurred together as she continued her work, each morning bringing new challenges and small victories. The first time she unearthed a patch of fertile soil, dark and rich beneath the tangled weeds, she felt a spark of pride that surprised her. She planted seeds she had found in an old tin in the pantry: tomatoes, beans, and a few flowers she couldn't identify, and watered them with a careful hand. She wasn't sure if anything would grow, but the act of planting felt significant, a gesture of hope in a world that had felt barren for so long. Max became her constant companion in the garden, his presence both a comfort and a source of amusement. He seemed to take an uncanny interest in her work, nosing at the rows of freshly turned earth and nudging her tools as if to inspect their worthiness. One afternoon, as she struggled to carry a heavy watering can across the garden, Max trotted over and stood directly in her path, his broad body blocking her way. "Move, Max," she said, her voice strained as she tried to maneuver around him. "This thing is heavy." Max didn't budge. Instead, he tilted his head and brayed loudly, the sound echoing through the valley. Lena groaned, setting the watering can down and placing her hands on her hips. "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head. "What do you want?" "A thank you for supervising." Max stepped closer, his nose brushing against her arm, and for a moment, Lena froze. His touch was warm, his breath soft against her skin, and something about the intimacy of the gesture made her chest tighten. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his coarse mane, and felt a wave of unexpected emotion rise within her. "Fine," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Max, for being here." It wasn't just the garden that began to change under her care. As the days turned into weeks, Lena felt a subtle shift within herself, a quiet awakening she hadn't anticipated. She found solace in the rhythm of the work, the way each task demanded her full attention and left no room for the spiraling thoughts that so often consumed her. The garden became a sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the simple, tangible act of creation. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and painted the garden in hues of gold and amber, Lena stood at the edge of her work and surveyed the progress she had made. The rows of seedlings were small but sturdy, their green leaves a vivid contrast against the dark soil. She felt a swell of pride, a warmth that spread through her chest and made her smile for the first time in what felt like forever. Max stood beside her, his head level with hers as he gazed out over the garden. She reached out and rested a hand on his neck, the gesture natural and unthinking. His fur was rough beneath her fingers, but the warmth of his body was grounding, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I think we make a pretty good team." Max didn't respond, but he leaned into her touch slightly, his ears twitching as if in agreement. The moment was simple, unremarkable in its details, but it held a weight that Lena couldn't ignore. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lena lingered in the garden, her hands still resting on Max's neck. She thought of Daniel, of the life she had left behind, and felt a pang of sorrow that no amount of work could erase. But she also thought of the future, of the seeds she had planted and the promise they held. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of growth, of healing, of something new. "Tomorrow," she said, glancing at Max with a small smile, "we'll tackle the weeds by the fence. What do you think?" Max brayed softly, the sound low and resonant in the quiet night, and Lena laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that carried on the breeze. She wrapped her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug, her cheek resting against his mane, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant as much for herself as for him. For everything. And as the garden lay quiet beneath the stars, its rows of seedlings swaying gently in the evening breeze, Lena felt a flicker of hope take root within her, a fragile, tender thing, but one that promised to grow. The letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Lena found the courage to open it. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, Maya's sharp, elegant script, each letter precise and deliberate. Her sister had always been that way, controlled, intentional, and fiercely protective of her own boundaries. They hadn't spoken in months, not since the truth of Lena's actions had unraveled her life and sent ripples of disgrace through their family. And yet, here was this letter, a fragile bridge stretched across the chasm between them. Lena hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. The kitchen was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Max stood outside the window, grazing in the garden, his steady presence both a comfort and a distraction. Taking a deep breath, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter was brief, but it carried the unmistakable weight of Maya's carefully chosen words. She didn't offer forgiveness or apologies, nor did she dwell on the details of Lena's mistakes. Instead, she wrote of the family dinner planned for the weekend, an event Lena had purposefully avoided for years. "It's time," Maya wrote simply. "We miss you. Come." Lena read the words over and over, her heart pounding with a mix of longing and fear. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the idea of facing her family's judgment, or the possibility that they might welcome her back, despite everything. For a long time she sat there, the letter clutched in her hands, until finally she folded it carefully and set it aside. "I don't think I can do this," she said aloud, glancing out the window at Max. He lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice, and brayed softly as if offering his own opinion. Lena rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "You think it's that simple, don't you?" she murmured, standing and stepping outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from the garden. She walked over to Max and leaned against the fence, her hands resting on the rough wood. "They're not like you," she continued, her voice quiet. "They won't just stand there and let me exist. They'll ask questions. They'll want answers I don't have." Max nudged her arm with his nose, a small, insistent gesture that made her laugh despite herself. She reached out to stroke his mane, her fingers threading through the coarse hair. "Fine," she said with a sigh. "I'll go. But if it goes horribly, I'm blaming you." The drive to Maya's house felt interminable, the winding country roads stretching on and on as Lena's anxiety grew. She had chosen her outfit carefully, something simple and unassuming, a conscious effort to appear unthreatening. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she rehearsed what she might say, how she might explain herself. But no matter how many times she tried to form the words, they refused to come. When she finally arrived, the house looked the same as it always had, a stately colonial tucked behind a line of tall trees, its white shutters gleaming in the afternoon sun. The driveway was already full, her parents' sedan and her brother's truck parked side by side. Lena pulled in slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and took a moment to gather herself before stepping out of the car. The front door opened before she could knock, and Maya stood there, her expression unreadable. She was as impeccably put together as always, her hair swept into a neat bun, and her tailored blouse crisp and pristine. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like a taut wire. "Hi," Lena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya's eyes softened just slightly, and she stepped aside to let her in. "Hi," she said simply. "Come in." The warmth of the house was a sharp contrast to the cool detachment Lena had expected. The familiar sense of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, and the sound of laughter echoed from the dining room. Her mother appeared from the kitchen, her face lighting up with surprise and something Lena couldn't quite name. "Lena," her mother said, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached. "You came." The hug that followed was tentative at first, but it quickly grew into something more, a fierce, wordless embrace that brought tears to Lena's eyes. Her father joined them a moment later, his large hands resting on her shoulders as he said nothing, just stood there, a solid and reassuring presence. Dinner was both easier and harder than Lena had imagined. The initial tension was palpable, but her family's warmth slowly began to thaw it, their questions gentle rather than accusatory. Her brother teased her, his jokes a thin veil over the unspoken understanding between them. Maya was quieter, her gaze sharp and discerning, but she made an effort, steering the conversation away from landmines and toward safer topics. It wasn't until the dishes were cleared and the wine poured that Maya finally spoke directly to Lena. They were sitting on the porch, the rest of the family still inside, their voices muffled by the glass doors. "Why now?" Maya asked, her tone measured but not unkind. Lena stared down at her glass, the deep red liquid catching the light. "I don't know," she admitted. I just got tired of running. Of being alone." Maya nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "We've been worried about you," she said. "Even after everything, you're still my sister. That hasn't changed." The words hit Lena harder than she expected, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She looked up at Maya, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. For everything." Maya reached out and placed a hand on Lena's, her grip firm. "I know," she said simply. "But you don't have to do this alone, okay? We're here." The drive home that night felt different, lighter somehow, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. When she pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the car, Max was there, standing in the moonlight with his ears perked and his tail swishing lazily. "I did it," Lena said, walking over to him. She leaned her forehead against his, the gesture one of quiet relief. "I don't know if I deserve it, but they're willing to try. Maybe that's enough." Max brayed softly, his breath warm against her skin, and Lena smiled. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on tightly as the night wrapped around them both. For the first time in a long time, she felt the stirrings of something she thought she'd lost forever, a sense of belonging, of family, of home. The storm came without warning. One moment, the late summer sky was bright with a piercing blue that promised nothing but peace, and the next, heavy gray clouds rolled in like an invading army, blotting out the sun. Lena stood at the edge of the garden, her hands dusted with soil, as the first drops of rain fell. The scent of ozone filled the air, sharp and electric, and a distant rumble of thunder rolled over the valley. "Max," she called, her voice tinged with urgency as she scanned the horizon for the donkey. He had wandered off earlier, his usual stubborn curiosity leading him to explore the far side of the property. Now, as the wind picked up and the rain began to fall in earnest, Lena's heart thudded with a mix of worry and frustration. The garden was the first casualty. The fragile rows of seedlings she had worked so hard to nurture buckled under the force of the downpour, their delicate leaves bent and battered by the relentless sheets of rain. Water pooled in the furrows between the rows, turning the carefully cultivated soil into a thick, clinging mud. Lena ran to the tool shed, grabbing a tarp and some stakes, desperate to shield what she could, but the wind fought her at every turn, tearing the tarp from her hands and whipping it into the air. "Damn it," she muttered, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She stumbled back to the porch, her clothes soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. The storm was relentless, the kind that seemed almost personal in its fury, as though the universe itself had decided to test her resolve. And then she saw him, Max, standing stubbornly in the middle of the field, his head lowered against the wind. Relief surged through her chest, followed quickly by irritation. "You idiot," she shouted, though her voice was lost in the roar of the storm. She grabbed a raincoat and boots, her movements frantic as she plunged back into the rain. The mud sucked at her boots as she trudged toward him, each step an exhausting effort. By the time she reached him, she was gasping for breath, her body trembling from a combination of exertion and cold. Max lifted his head as she approached, his ears flicking back as though in acknowledgement of her presence. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger and worry. She grabbed his halter, tugging gently but firmly. "Come on, we need to get inside." Max brayed loudly, his voice cutting through the chaos of the storm, and for a moment he resisted, his hooves planted firmly in the mud. But then, as though sensing her desperation, he relented, following her back toward the house. The journey felt endless, the wind and rain lashing at them with unrelenting force, but finally they reached the barn. Lena guided Max inside, her hands shaking as she latched the door behind them. The barn was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of hay and damp wood. Lena collapsed onto a bale of hay, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Max stood a few feet away, shaking the water from his coat, his movements slow and deliberate. The sight of him alive, safe, brought a wave of relief so powerful that it left her momentarily lightheaded. "You scared the hell out of me," she said, her voice hoarse as she leaned back against the wall. Max turned his head toward her, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light, and took a step closer. His breath was warm against her skin as he nuzzled her shoulder, a small, unexpected gesture that made her chest tighten. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the storm raging outside a distant roar. Lena reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Max's mane. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. His presence, his stubbornness, his refusal to let her face the storm alone, it all felt like a lifeline she hadn't realized she needed. When the storm finally passed, it left devastation in its wake. The garden was unrecognizable, the carefully tended rows of plants drowned or uprooted, the soil churned into a muddy mess. Lena stood at the edge of the destruction, her heart sinking as she surveyed the damage. Days, weeks of work, all undone in a single night. The sight of it brought tears to her eyes, hot and bitter, and she sank to her knees, the mud soaking through her jeans as she covered her face with her hands. Max stood beside her, his presence a quiet, steady comfort. He nudged her gently with his nose, his breath warm against her cheek, and she lowered her hands, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I worked so hard, and now it's all gone." Max brayed softly, a low, resonant sound that seemed almost soothing, and Lena couldn't help but laugh, a small, choked sound that caught in her throat. "Of course you don't care," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "You're a donkey. You don't worry about things like this." But as she stood there, her hands clenched into fists, a spark of determination began to stir within her. The garden wasn't gone, it was damaged, yes, but not beyond saving. The roots were still there, hidden beneath the mud, waiting for her to uncover them. The thought gave her a sense of purpose, a small but powerful reminder that she wasn't as helpless as she felt. She spent the next few days working tirelessly to salvage what she could. The work was grueling, her body aching with the effort of clearing the mud and replanting the seedlings, but she refused to give up. Max was always there, his presence a constant, unspoken encouragement. He followed her as she worked, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that felt almost human. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and painted the valley in hues of gold and amber, Lena stood in the garden, her hands on her hips, and surveyed her progress. The rows of plants were uneven, the soil still damp and clinging to her boots, but there was life there, small, fragile sprouts that had survived the storm. Max stood beside her, his head level with hers, and she reached out to rest a hand on his neck. "We did it," she said softly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and pride. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Max brayed, the sound low and resonant, and Lena laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet evening. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her cheek resting against his mane, and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for not letting me give up." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lena felt a quiet sense of accomplishment settle over her. The storm had tested her, pushed her to her limits, but it hadn't broken her. With Max by her side, she had faced the chaos and found the strength to keep going. And as she stood there, the garden slowly coming back to life around her, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile, tender thing, but one that promised to grow. The first rays of dawn spilled over the valley, washing the fields in a soft, golden light that shimmered like liquid warmth. Lena stood by the kitchen window, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The glass was slightly fogged from the warmth of the house meeting the crisp morning air outside, and she absently traced a line through the condensation with her finger. The garden stretched out before her, vibrant and alive again, a testament to the months of care and determination she had poured into it. Each row of green leaves seemed to reach toward the rising sun, as though they too were ready for a fresh beginning. Max stood at the edge of the garden, his sturdy silhouette framed by the soft glow of dawn. He turned his head slightly, as though sensing her gaze, and let out a soft bray. Lena smiled, setting her cup down on the counter. "You're always the first one up," she murmured, pulling on her boots and stepping outside. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the rich earth of the garden. Her breath formed soft clouds in front of her as she walked toward Max, her steps deliberate but unhurried. He met her halfway, his ears flicking as he nuzzled her arm. She laughed softly, reaching up to scratch behind his ears. "Good morning to you, too," she said, her voice light. "Ready for another day?" It had become their ritual, these quiet moments in the early morning, when the world was just beginning to stir. Lena found herself looking forward to them, the simplicity and steadiness of Max's companionship grounding her in a way she hadn't thought possible. He was a constant in her life now, an anchor she hadn't realized she needed. The day unfolded gently, filled with the satisfying rhythm of tasks that had become second nature. Lena moved through her chores with an ease that surprised her, her hands working the soil, her mind quiet and focused. The garden, once a symbol of everything she thought she had lost, now felt like an extension of herself, messy, imperfect, but undeniably alive. In the afternoon, as the sun climbed high in the sky, she paused to take stock of her progress. The rows of vegetables were thriving, their leaves a vibrant green, and the flowers she had planted along the edges added splashes of color that made her heart lift. She brushed her hands against her jeans, wiping away the dirt, and let out a contented sigh. Max ambled over, his hooves making soft thuds against the packed earth. He stopped beside her, his head level with hers, and let out a low, rumbling bray. Lena turned to him, her smile widening. "You know, I couldn't have done this without you," she said, her voice warm. "You've been my partner in all of this." He nudged her gently, his nose brushing against her shoulder, and Lena laughed, a sound full of genuine joy. She wrapped her arms around his neck, holding him close, and closed her eyes. The heat of the sun on her skin, the scent of the garden, and the steady warmth of Max against her, all of it, felt like a quiet affirmation that she was exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena sat on the porch with a pen and a notebook in her lap. The pages were blank, waiting for words she wasn't sure she could write. She had been avoiding this moment for weeks, hesitant to confront the lingering threads of her past. But now, with the garden flourishing around her and the quiet strength she had found in herself and Max, she felt ready. The letter to Daniel wasn't easy to write. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, but as the minutes passed, they began to flow. She wrote about the mistakes she had made, the pain she had caused, and the lessons she had learned. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she didn't feel she had the right, but she expressed her gratitude for the love they had shared and the life they had built together. By the time she finished, her hand was trembling, her chest tight with emotion, but there was a sense of release that came with putting it all into words. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into an envelope, and set it aside. The act felt like closing a door, not slamming it shut, but gently easing it closed, leaving room for whatever might come next. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the garden, where the first stars were beginning to appear above the darkening horizon. Max stood at the edge of the porch, his silhouette dark against the fading light. He looked up at her, his ears twitching, and Lena felt a warmth spread through her chest. She stepped off the porch and walked to him, her hand reaching out to rest against his neck. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said softly. Max brayed in response, the sound low and resonant, and Lena smiled. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, steady joy. Lena continued her work in the garden, planting new seeds and tending to the growing plants with a care that felt second nature now. She began reaching out to her family more often, inviting them to visit and sharing meals on the porch as the sun set over the valley. Maya came by one afternoon, her sharp wit softened by a warmth Lena hadn't seen in years, and together they laughed and talked late into the evening. Through it all, Max was there, a constant presence, his steady gaze and quiet companionship a source of strength Lena hadn't realized she needed. He followed her as she worked, his braze punctuating her thoughts, his stubborn insistence on being near her both maddening and endearing. He was more than just a companion now, he was a symbol of the life she was building, one moment at a time. One morning, as Lena stood in the garden, the sun warm on her skin and the scent of blooming flowers filling the air, she felt a deep, quiet contentment settle over her. The garden was thriving, her relationships were healing, and for the first time in a long time she felt whole. She looked over at Max, who was grazing nearby, his ears flicking in the breeze, and smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm, "for everything." Max lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers, and brayed softly. The sound was like an echo of her own emotions, simple, honest, and full of life. And as the day stretched out before them, Lena felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. This was her new beginning, her dawn. And with Max by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.